Talking about Gerrard Winstanley, who was born 1609 in Wigan and died in 1676. He was, there were a lot of radicals in the 17th century in England. He was probably the biggest rebel, the biggest radical of them all. There's much been written about him. I can't summarize all his philosophical and radical ideological views. I will give a very brief summary of that, but I want to focus on his family and the influence of Wigan on him. He's famous because he espoused a program for radical change, political, social, and religious change for the country. Much of which has been passed through in literature and is popular by some groups today. In 1649, he founded a group called the Diggers. They're also known as the True Levelers. That's because there was another radical group called the Levelers, which was headed by John Lilburne. They advocated substantial change, but nowhere near as radical change as Gerrard Winstanley and the Diggers. And he's written very extensively. I recommend, if anyone wants to read a short book that's well written and a paperback, it's a book called Gerrard Winstanley by John Gurney, and it was printed by Pluto Press in 2012. If you want the full works of Gerrard Winstanley, they're available as is the complete works of Gerrard Winstanley is available for about, I think they're about £600 if you want to buy the full 2 editions. Some of the ways in which we recognize him today, of course, there's the annual Diggers Festival in Wigan, which has been going for about 10 years now. Of course, this year was interrupted by the coronavirus events, but it started off 10 years ago in the Pear Tree. And I gave the first talk on Gerrard Winstanley at that first meeting. There's also a memorial to Gerrard Winstanley in Belief Square up at the top of the Weald. And I believe in Museum of Wigan Life, there's now a small display, including one of his books. In Crawford Street, we have Gerrard Winstanley House, the old courts buildings. I don't know for sure, but I've been told that it was given its name in the 1960s when communists were quite active in Wigan. If any of you have any other knowledge of the naming of that house, I would appreciate knowing. There's much been written in world literature about Gerrard Winstanley, a lot of academic researchers, and today there's still new articles come out about Gerrard Winstanley each year. One interesting evidence of the recognition of his activities and his philosophies was an obelisk in Moscow, and here it is. In 1913, I think it was, an obelisk was erected to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the Romanov dynasty. Back in 1918, of course, things changed substantially in Russia, and they demolished that and erected a new monument, an obelisk, to the key socialist thinkers throughout history. And at the top, as you would expect, there's Marx and Engels. And if you come down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This is apparently Winstanley in Russian. And below that, interestingly, here is Thomas More. Some of you might know the major work that Thomas More wrote called Utopia back in, I think it was 1516. So we've taken a brief look at his philosophy and his actions. He basically said everybody's born equal. There's no difference between the king, the leader of the church, the lord of the manor, or the peasants. Everybody was born equal and should be treated equally. And his famous commitment is that the earth should be regarded as a common treasury for all, not for the use and profit of just a few. And the diggers, of course, cultivated common land. I'll say a little more about that later. He completely wanted to overthrow the existing social, economic, and religious practices. He wanted to get rid of the lords of the manor, private property, no wages, no buying and selling of goods for profit. People should be contributing to their own needs and be allowed to obtain what they needed without profit for anyone. He rejected all organized religion. Once he started his radical activities, he never referred to God again in his writings. He referred to what he called reason, which he interpreted, or it seems that he interpreted to be an inner God that each person had within himself or herself the ability to sort out their own life and develop their own salvation. There's no need to be dependent on an outside external being or God. And rather than any beliefs or teachings, he said that people should rely on their experience and reason, rather than being told what to do at school or learn what to do in church or by anybody else. So what do we know about his formative years? Very little. It's a huge mystery. All the academics recognize there's almost a complete lack of knowledge of his family. We do know his father, and I'll bring that up later. And interestingly, in all his writings, all his books, all his pamphlets, he never once mentioned Wigan or his family. And the academics have really acknowledged that the source of his radicalism is largely unidentified. So what follows, I'll try and identify some of those gaps, particularly his family and some of the influences that Wigan probably had on him. So what do we know about him? We know he was baptized in Wigan in October 1609. All this is documented in the Wigan registers. His father was Edward Winstanley, who we know was a mercer, that's a cloth merchant. Nothing is known about his mother. In those days, in the registers, only the father's name was given. So it's very difficult to find anything about other members of his family. When he was 21, he went down to London and was apprenticed at Merchant Taylor's Company, obviously to become a more accomplished cloth merchant. And in 1638, 8 years later, he became a freeman of Merchant Taylor's Company. And he set up his own cloth business in London, which was reasonably successful, but nothing really outstanding. While in London, he married Susan King, who was daughter of a pretty well-established, famous London surgeon. After a few years in business, he became bankrupt in 1643. And a lot of activities went on, but he ended up moving down to Surrey, where he worked as a cowherd, an overseer of the poor, and a church warden. What's important, while in Surrey in 1648, he went through what I'm calling a midlife crisis and what he called enlightenment. And that's what really turned him around when he became the radical person that he was. So going back to his family, we know he was born in Wigan in 1609. So the first thing I did, and other people have tried to do, was go through the Wigan registers, the first ones from 1580 to 1625, to see if we could find the father who gave birth to a son called Edward Winstanley. And rigorous look at those records indicates that's not feasible. There is no one in Wigan who could have given birth to Edward in 1609. No one born in Wigan who could have given birth to Edward in 1609. So you have to look outside Wigan. outside Wigan Parish. And some birth records are available in parishes, particularly to the south and west of Wigan, Warrington, Prescott, Windle, and so on, Ormskirk. And I couldn't find anything that was convincing there. So I looked at the wills, Chester wills, and there something very interesting came up. There was a Thomas Winstanley, died 1593. I don't know exactly when he was born, who married an Alice Winstanley. And Thomas was clerk and late dean of Warrington Deanery. That Warrington Deanery was part of the Diocese of Chester. Wigan was in the Warrington Deanery. So he obviously had a substantial rank within the Protestant church, probably fairly influential and certainly very knowledgeable about the Wigan parish. In his will, he dedicated his property that he owned and his land to his children. And it gives the names of his children: Thomas, Alexander, Cicely, Elizabeth, and Edward. So we have an Edward, the son of Thomas. So that's a distinct possibility to being the father of Gerrard, because we know Gerrard's father was an Edward. And Edward, interestingly, is an unusual name in the Winstanley family in those days. The common Winstanley names were Edmund, William, James, and so on. So following the possibility that this Edward was Gerrard's father, there was an Edward married an Isabel in Prescott in 1593. He was probably born around, I'm guessing, around 1575. And the records in Wigan Register shows that Edward died in 1639. He was a mercer. We know Gerrard's father was a mercer, and he was a burgess in Wigan. When he died in 1639, he was also titled Mr. So that puts him at a substantial social level to be called Mr. So as well as giving birth to Gerrard in 1609, Edward gave birth to Humphrey, Alice, and Ellen. So these would have been Gerrard Winstanley's brothers and sisters. These would have been his aunts and uncles. What gives me confidence to believe that these are the grandparents and parents of Gerrard are the actual names, Edward and Gerrard. As I mentioned, Edward is a very unusual name in the Winstanley family. It was probably that he was named by Thomas, Edward's father, after Edward Fleetwood, who was rector of the Lord and Lord of the Manor in Wigan from 1571 to 1604. Gerrard, interestingly, who was Edward's son, most likely was named after Gerrard Massey, who was again rector and Lord of Manor of Wigan in 1604 to 1616. So this shows that this branch of the Winstanley family were very closely tied in to the church and rectory in Wigan. I want to talk a little bit about some of the important people in Wigan at the time of leading up to Gerrard Winstanley's birth and about the time when he was living in Wigan. Going back, you're all familiar with Winstanley Hall. That was built 1555 to 1561 by Thomas Winstanley and his wife Elizabeth. When Thomas died, his son Edmund inherited the hall and estate. Edmund married, but they never wanted to live in Winstanley after a few years. And in the 1560s, they went back to Wales, where Edmund was actually born. So Winstanley Hall was pretty not occupied very much for a couple of decades. The person in charge of Winstanley Hall, a steward of the hall, was Thomas's brother, Edmund, who was Edmund Winstanley's uncle. So that was Uncle Ed. Uncle Ed was also steward of Wigan Parish Church. So again, showing a very close link between the Winstanley family and the running of Wigan Parish Church. Uncle Ed married Mary Langton, who was daughter of Sir Thomas Langton, Baron of Newton. The Baron of Newton had been the avowson of Wigan Parish Church for hundreds of years. So this is demonstrating the fact that the Winstanley family married very deeply into some of the very important people in Wigan. Mary's brother was Richard Langton, who was the son of Sir Thomas Langton, and he was also rector and lord of the manor in Wigan in about mid-1500s. Some important people were not directly members of the Winstanley family, but were very influential in the running of Wigan, and I'm sure in Gerrard Winstanley's life. People like James Banks, who bought Winstanley Hall and Estate from Edmund Winstanley in 1596 for the amount of £30,000, which today will be about £8.5 million. James Banks was from Wigan, and he earned his wealth as a gold merchant and banker in London. Henry Mason was another Wiganer who was very closely connected to the people who established Gerrard Winstanley as apprentice in the Merchant Taylors Company. Hugh Bullock, who I'll say more about later. People like Francis Sherrington, who's well known in being a benefactor of Wigan Grammar School. Sherrington's sister Susan had also married James Banks. So these people were very closely intertwined, sometimes intermarried, and established strong ties down in London, which I'm sure helped Gerrard Winstanley as he moved from London to being a student at Merchant Taylors Company. So Hugh Bullock, interestingly, as far as I can tell, was the first Wiganer to be admitted to the Merchant Taylors Company back in 1587. And there was another person, Richard Winstanley, who became a freeman of the Merchant Taylors Company in 1628. So that was before Gerrard Winstanley. So what we see is roots of connections from Wigan to London, and particularly the Merchant Taylors Company. Interestingly, Hugh Bullock, recognized as a Wigan haberdasher, was granted 2,500 acres in Virginia, in this country, back in 1634. He obviously became his own captain of his own ship, and first went to Virginia in the early 1620s. So he would have been one of the earliest settlers in this country. And after that, he returned to London and gave the land in this country to his son. Background to Gerrard Winstanley's radical activities in the late 1640s, 1650. We're all aware that England was going through a civil war, or rather civil wars, during the 1640s, where the authority of the king and the church were severely challenged by the people. England was still very much a feudal system, with the king or queen at the top, the barons and so on below, with a lot of peasants and people with no land of their own at the bottom. There was, however, an emerging merchant class with growing capitalism. And Winstanley's themselves, I've alluded to briefly, they made the money that allowed them to build Winstanley Hall by becoming wool merchants in Wales back from about the late 1400s to mid 1500s. So they were well established in the merchant cloth trade. And obviously Gerrard Winstanley's father was a cloth merchant, and they obviously wanted Gerrard to become a cloth merchant. There's also a lot of religious changes going on, the Reformation, the abolishment of the Catholic Church in England, establishment of Protestantism as the main religion. There were many struggles with new religious groups being formed. It was a time of the scientific revolution. Sir Francis Bacon, of course, was very instrumental in establishing the scientific methodology. in the late 1640s, there were also periods of severe drought and food shortages, and radical social groups were popping up all over the place, including the diggers. So by the late 1640s, Winstanley was pretty much bankrupt and poor. He hit rock bottom. And then in 1648, he wrote that he had a trance where his ideology and his philosophies were totally changed. A lot of people have tried to interpret this trance in many different ways, forms of religion and mysticism. I like to keep it simple and say it was just a process of deep meditation and soul searching, which people who are at the rock bottom often do. You either don't come out of it or you come out with a shining new light. During that deep meditation, he would have questioned every aspect of his life, from growing up, going to London, marrying, becoming a cloth merchant, etc., etc. And he would have questioned what was going on in the religion and the politics in the country. And he determined, remembering that he himself was now a poor man, he would have appreciated what it meant to live in poverty. And he decided that the only way to get out of poverty for everybody was a complete overturn of the social, political, and religious system. And during this deep searching, he would have recalled his upbringing in Wigan. So going back to the history of Wigan, leading up to a very important event in 1618 that I'll get to, it's important to recognize that Henry III granted Wigan a royal charter of freedom in 1246. There were burgesses who were classed as free tenants to the rector. As long as they paid their rent, they had 1¼ acres for their own burgage, and they had the right to common pasture, timber, stone, and clay on the land that belonged to Wigan. Over the next few centuries, there was constant struggles between the rector, who was also lord of the manor, and the Wigan burgesses and the corporation about these rights. Interestingly, Bridgman, who wrote the history of Wigan back in 1888, said he knew of no other instance where the joint roles of secular priest and lord of the manor provided such complete powers. It was extremely unusual that the rector was also the lord of the manor, but that combination gave him a lot of power over the people living in Wigan, which at the time would have had a population of about 5,000. And to point to one of the points that Gerrard Winstanley made, a lot of the people were into the senior posts in religion, not just because they believed in God, but because it was a well-paid job and their income was substantial. For example, John Bridgman, who was rector of Wigan and became Bishop of Chester in 1619, his salary, his income in 1619 was about £1,000, which was about £250,000 today. So that led up to what happened in 1618. Remember, in 1618, Gerrard Winstanley was still in Wigan. He would have been about 9 years old. And the Wiganers were successful in elevating their disputes with the rector and lord of the manor to the king, to King James I. Imagine today if some disputes in Wigan were successful in raising to the Queen to get some resolution. The king appointed 4 arbiters, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Bishop of Ely, and 2 chief justices. They concluded that the rector should continue to own the manor, including the wastes, the common lands. However, the freeholders and all the inhabitants should have access to and use the wastes, including digging for clay and coal. Clay was particularly important because there were a lot of potters in Wigan, and it's important that they were allowed to dig clay. And coal was just being started to be dug and became very important for the development of Wigan. So as Gerrard Winstanley looked back at his time in Wigan and what was going on and what he learned, he would have realized that Wiganers, through their concerted union action, acting together by elevating their claims, earned the right to use unfarmed common land, and that land was a common treasury for all. So in 1649, Gerrard Winstanley and a band of diggers started digging and cultivating common land in St. George's Hill and Cobham in Surrey. They typically grew a variety of vegetables. There were, I'm not sure how many people, 8 or 9 in the band that became the diggers in Surrey. Other bands of diggers were established in other counties such as Northamptonshire, Kent, and Buckinghamshire. However, the diggers' activities only lasted for about 12 months. In 1650, Cromwell's men came and expressed their desire that they take the hook and go somewhere else. And the local residents, of course, were not very happy with this band digging up the land close by where they lived. So despite only lasting 12 months as the digger activity, Winstanley continued to publish very prolifically. So going to the question of why Winstanley never mentioned his family or Wigan in his tremendous amount of books and pamphlets that he wrote. So let's have a look at what we know. His family in Wigan and the Wigan area owned land and property and made money from buying and selling land, property and goods. For instance, Winstanley Hall, Winstanley Estate was sold for a fortune. Gerrard's father was a mercer who bought and sold goods for profit, and so on. Gerrard Winstanley, however, now believed that everybody was equal and the earth was common property for all. Gerrard Winstanley's family were Protestants, as we've seen, very strongly active in the church. Gerrard Winstanley, after his enlightenment, decried all organized religion and believed in this reason, inner religion. Wigan, of course, was a strong loyalist stronghold. Gerrard Winstanley wanted to abolish the monarchy and supported Cromwell, whose forces sacked Wigan and Latham House, which was the stronghold home of Lord Derby. So you can imagine why Gerrard Winstanley didn't want to go back to Wigan or mention his family when his views were now totally antithetical to what they had and held in Wigan. Later in life, after 1652, he returned to Cobham in Surrey and he actually became a Quaker. He was probably buried a Quaker. In 1665, he married his second wife, Elizabeth Stanley, and they had 2 sons and a daughter. As far as I can tell, the 2 sons died before their mother died, and the daughter probably did also. So I'm not sure whether any of his children actually had children of their own. That's not determined. He also became a corn chandler in London and overseer of the poor, church warden and chief constable in Surrey. So he had a complete turn of beliefs again. I guess he gave up on everything he'd been preaching for years. Whether he did this in order to be embodied back in society or whether he became a true believer, I guess we just don't know. One interesting fact was that several legal cases he was involved in, his lawyer was James Winstanley of Gray's Inn. James Winstanley came from Winstanley. His mother lived in Hough Wood, which was a detached part of Winstanley in Billinge. As far as I can tell, but I can't prove conclusively, this James Winstanley was a descendant of James Winstanley, who was brother of Thomas Winstanley, who built Winstanley Hall. This James Winstanley did very well, but as a lawyer in London, and in the 1650s, he bought Braunston Estate in Leicestershire and married into blue blood. So Gerrard Winstanley died at the age of 66. And after that, he was largely forgotten until his writings were revived by Russian communists back in the late 1800s. And we've seen a subsequent recent surge in activities associated with his beliefs and ideologies. So today, he's still very much remembered, and there's still a lot of research going on about him. But I think we've contributed here to a better understanding of his family and why he never mentioned his family or Wigan in his writings. So that's where I'd like to end.